The science that goes on here impacts not only the state of Texas, but impacts the whole globe. We have a group of scientists that work well together. They are wonderful contributors to the breadth of knowledge that is needed so that we can sustain the coast and the ocean. This one is more devastating, I think, than even Celia. Having the eyewall sit right over us for that length of time was a new storm experience for Port Aransas.
Initially, we thought it was just going to be a tropical storm, more of a rain event. Watching on the news, about 60 miles out at a Category 3, I figured we were in for the worst and it was going to be a Category 4. If I could describe what it looked like, a complete disaster as in a true sense. Shingles everywhere, nails everywhere, no running water, no power, everything was dark. I think the thing that emanated the most was the smell.
Unfortunately, because the labs remained without power for so long, so there was no air conditioning. There was basically a lake of water in each lab. So these instruments that we use to do all of our research are really sensitive to humidity. We have to keep the lab at a very specific humidity. And they basically sat in, non-air conditioned environment for a week or 10 days. And so even though the instruments all look okay from the outside, they weren't actually affected by the hurricane the day of. We think that many of them are going to be pretty badly affected from the aftermath of the storm.
One of the saddest things, our peer lab with our instrumentation survived the storm and sent data through the entire storm. A drilling ship broke away from its moorings kind of next to the ferry, grounded on San Jose Island. Monday night the tide came up, it broke loose and took our pier and all the instrumentation out. And that was sort of like the real kick in the gut. To say, well, that made it, and that continued to do its job, and then to have that happen was just a real difficult pill to swallow.
We had just been up in the Arctic, and it's not as simple as flying up to the Arctic and getting on a boat and getting in the water. I mean, everything is hard, and to go through that and bring all this stuff back and realize we just lost everything that we had in there, and we can't even think about getting it back until a year from now when we go back up to the Arctic. That's very frustrating, and just sort of, you just feel pretty helpless. Like there's not much you can do.
So I arrived back to Port Aransas 5 days after the storm, after the mandatory evacuation had been lifted. And when I walked into the house, I found that it had been flooded by about 20 inches of storm surge here in the garage, which is a mix of storm surge and sewage that had backed up through all the plumbing systems throughout the neighborhood. And it had covered everything it touched in a putrid film of mud that had really ruined everything that it had touched and left it just extremely slick and covered in this awful smelling ooze. This was my first hurricane experience and the first time that I'd been involved in a natural disaster, or at least my home had. And at first it is very overwhelming to come back and see what has happened to your town and your neighborhood and your own home. And my research involves growth increments. So I'm originally trained as a tree ring scientist and measuring growth increment widths in trees to tell us about long forest histories. And I apply those tree ring techniques into growth increments of long-lived fish and bivalves to answer similar questions in the ocean. This makes my research much more personal, having experienced this kind of disaster that is a function of climate and is the kind of outcome that we would expect under climate change scenarios. And so this does very much personalize my work, has given me a new interest in hurricanes and these destructive events along the Gulf Coast.
And I think people who have the opportunity to live on the coast and know the impact of the coast feel responsible for seeing that the value of that resource for the state of Texas, the people of Texas, is continued. I'm not a scientist, but what goes on at the Marine Science Institute is the work that will keep that coast viable for generations. I know the character of the island. I know the character of the people of the island. And this is a rough go. There's no question about that. It will be a new normal, but it will be back to normal and people will rebuild. And this institute will be back and it will become more and more important generationally as we become more and more dependent upon our coasts and oceans. That dependency is only going to grow. It's not going to lessen. And we're going to have to understand what we can do to keep it viable for all the resources that it provides.